So let's begin and daven that the zchut of our learning should help to finally bring home all of the hostages and protect our soldiers and Am Yisrael, all of the innocents, and be an Ilui Neshama for my mother, Shloma Leah Bas, Menachem Mendel, Rachel.
Amen.
And with that, let's just remind ourselves what we're up to here. So we started last time with this Braita, Tanura Banan Mefakim Pikuach Nefesh B'Shabbat, right? And then Abazariz Harez Mishubach Vein Sarich Itol Reshut Mi Beit Din. So this was the theme of the Braita. Then it gave us 4 examples of Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos, and it repeated these clauses: Azariz Harez Mishubach Vein Sarich Itol Reshut Mi Beit Din. Just to remind ourselves, so there were these 4. There was the child that fell into the sea, and we're supposed to fish him out with a net, even if we end up catching fish. Good day. Then we talked about a child who fell into a pit, and that we can dig out a step to step down and pull him out. And again, even though it's Shabbos, and even though you're going to end up creating a step, making a step on Shabbos, and then we had the child who got locked into a room, and the only way to get him out would be to break down the door. So you're allowed to chop down the door in such a way that you can still use the wood afterwards. And then the last one was if a fire broke out and we were afraid that it was going to possibly end up threatening the lives of people who could not be easily evacuated, according to Rashi, right? Either old people or children or sickly people, then you're allowed to put it out, or you're allowed to place things in its way so that the fire won't spread. So there are a number of issues, and even though when as you're putting out the fire, maybe you're going to lay down you'll push down the fire, like physically push it down, so that it's burning and not spreading, but it will turn into coals that you'll be able to use after Shabbos. And then the Gemara did this trichusa. One of the things, there's a few questions that have come up that I think should be addressed. I'm not going to try to address them today because eventually we're going to have to go back through all of this again. But one of the things that I think is very, very interesting, this question of so if the child falls into the sea, that's obviously a case where the child's life is threatened. But what's the threat if the child falls into a pit? What's the threat if to the child's life that the child is locked behind a door? So the Gemara, when it was doing the tzrichusa, it was telling why I need each of the 4 cases. So let's just run through them again quickly. So it's a tzricha, I need the case. Right? That if I need all 4 cases, because if I'd only learned the case of the child falling into the sea, then I'm afraid that adahachi bahachi, right? Toch kedei, like during that time, he'll go. In other words, he'll be lost altogether, meaning he's going to die. But
Right.
bored, kayativ emalo. But if he's sitting in a pit, then I would say, no, I don't have to violate Shabbos for a child who's fell into a pit. because he's not going anywhere. So tzricha, so I need it. So it still doesn't, at that point, I still don't know exactly why I break Shabbos for the child falls in the pit. I know that I do, but I don't know why. Then the Gemara says, Yashmin and Bor, Mishum de bit. So if I learn the case of the child falling into the pit, so why do I save him? Because he'll be afraid, he'll be frightened. But if he's locked behind a door, it's possible that he's sitting on that side, and I can distract him by playing with nuts, which Rashi understands the fateh that he he entices him by cracking nuts, or not cracking, but like shaking them, like making noises. So in this context, I can understand these two sort of one with the other. That is, if the child is in the pit, he'll be frightened and you won't be able to do anything to assuage him. But if the child is in a room behind a door, you simply can't get through the door, you can reduce his anxiety by playing something, like doing something that he hears noises, and you'll be able to keep him from being frightened. So that's all very well and good. But so why is it though that I would break Shabbos just to keep a child from being frightened? What's the danger to the child's life?
It doesn't sound like pikuach nefesh. That's the
It
question.
does, yeah, that it doesn't sound like pikuach nefesh. So the Braita comes to tell you that it is, but it doesn't explain why, except in other words, the Gemara is explaining that the pikuach nefesh is somehow related to the child's fear. If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure exactly why that's a reason to break Shabbos for the child. It's not clear to me, and I haven't dug deep into it, but it's not clear to me. Um, except I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, and no, because it just doesn't sound like a case of pikuach nefesh that the child you can wait till after Shabbat. Maybe in the case of the boar, there's a fear of the pit falling in. Maybe there's some danger there, I guess. But a child behind the door, um, other than the equivalent of the house collapsing, which is not likely, I don't know.
Yeah. So what's interesting is what you say is perfectly reasonable with the pit. Maybe there's a danger because of the pit itself. Maybe the pit could fall in, or famously we have the medrash about when Yosef was in the pit, right?
Or
The
yeah, scorpions and snakes.
right, but there, yeah, because the Torah says a borek ein bo mayim didn't have any water, and the drasha is, but it had scorpions and snakes. So you could also say, God, a kid falls in a pit, we're afraid that maybe there's something that's going to attack him that could be life-threatening. But what's interesting is the Gemara doesn't say that. Gemara says the kami beat because
Uh,
he's in fear. So maybe the fact that the child is in fear, that's enough to consider it pikuach nefesh. Uh, what I want to say is a lo muvan me'elav. Like it's not something that I would take for granted one way or the other. So, and the same for the child behind the door, right? So in both of those cases, it's not clear from the Gemara what the life-threatening aspect is. But the Gemara seems to assume that, in other words, so, and then Mimela, the pit, in other words, the Gemara is saying, okay, so the pit, the kid is frightened. But if he's behind a door, we could keep him from being frightened because you can amuse him through the door so that he won't be, you can assuage him. That's this whole idea of playing with the nuts to assuage the child. So there, but nonetheless, you're still allowed to break down the door. So the whole thing is that whole part is really unclear to me, and I blame myself for not looking into it further on this past week or so. I was mostly concentrating on the next part of the sugya, which is even more difficult. But these were questions that I had from the beginning. These are lingering questions. So for the moment, we're going to let them linger, and
Okay.
and we're going to continue. I want to do a reading. I want to try to read this sugya to the end. This next part of the sugya gets into concepts which appear elsewhere in other contexts, and they've always fascinated me, and so maybe that's why I spent more time on this sugya. And let's read this. So, Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda.
Okay. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Lo halchu bepikuach nefesh acher harov. Hechi dame, inema deicha tesha Yisrael v'goy echad beinehu, ruva Yisrael ninehu. Ele, plaga uplaga, safek nafshot v'hakel. Ele deika tesha goyim Yisrael echad, Hanami Peshita, Dahavi Leia Kavua, Bukol Kavua, Bemechetza, Al Mechetza Dame.
Kim Echta.
Okay, Kemeksa, Al Mechetza Dame. Lo, Tzricha, de Farush, de Frush le Chatzer Acheret. Mah Ditema, called the Fresh Maruba Haresh, Kamashman Lan, the lo halchu bepikuach nefesh acher harov.
Okay. So hi, Paul. I did you missed the beginning of the shir where I looked over a little bit from last week. Wait a second.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear.
He can hear us. He's getting up and walking away. Let's give him a second.
Okay.
See if we can rope him in while we're at the beginning of this part of the sugya. I think both, I'll just ask you. So you see the Gemara here talks about Rov and Mechza, Mechza, Kol Kavua. Have you ever learned any Gemaras about this? Kol Kavua, Kemechza, Mechza Dami?
No, I don't think so. No.
There's a few sugyas in the Gemara that it comes up in Sanhedrin and in Tubot, in Nida. There's a few places where this comes up. And it's a very interesting concept. Okay, so I didn't know where Paul went, so we're going to continue. So let's go back. Maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger even. Hold on.
Yeah, I don't have my big monitor. In fact, I should go get my glasses,
Okay.
but
No,
I'm
it's
just using
okay.
the
Maybe
laptop. That's
maybe
better.
that'll help. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I should have done that to begin with. All right, so go back. Amar Rav Yosef. So
Okay.
Let's start to translate.
So Rav Yosef said, Rav Yehuda said, Shmuel said, they don't go, that we, Pekuach Nefesh doesn't go after the Rov.
Okay, so stop. Yeah, so what does
Okay.
that mean?
So it's not Rov is typically numbers, but is it um, statistics like something's not likely to occur? We don't take that into account?
Okay, so this is the question. So hold on now. Paul is back. Paul, tell me if you can hear me. I think he.
Yes, now I do hear you. I had a problem with the Bluetooth. Okay,
Okay. All right. Yes, I've had my own
okay.
set of technical challenges in the last day. I got a new phone yesterday, and of course now I'm challenged with the new phone. But okay. So Paul, what I was saying before you came, I brought up
Yes,
some questions from what we learned last week, and I just said that we're going to leave the questions hanging, and we're starting the next part of the sugya. And this is what
okay.
Michael just read. So we have this ma'amar in the name of Shmuel, where Shmuel says, "Lo halchu b'fikuach nefesh achar harov." So Michael is explaining just the plain words mean, right, that in the category of pikuach nefesh, in the halachic category of pikuach nefesh, we don't go after a majority. We don't go after the rov. And Michael was saying what it sounds like is that we're not going to use some kind of a statistical uh, majority in making a decision when it comes to pikuach nefesh. And this question of here, the way it's put, going after the rope, we've already brought this up without using this term. This has come up already earlier in the Gemara, right? When we talked about uh, when we were talking about different remedies uh, for diseases or for illnesses. Uh, I put forth, I offered an idea that Rabbi Matya ben Harash, who says that you can feed somebody chatzer kaved of a dog, so maybe the Chamim say no. Maybe the machloket is how efficacious that is, and then the question would be, right? We talked about this. The question would be, let's say it's efficacious in a small in a small percentage of cases, but still safek nefashot lahakel. So why wouldn't I give it to him anyway, right? So there we saw that the Rambam answered by saying there are different kinds of remedies, and the remedy of a chatzer kaved is the remedy miskula, and it's not essentially from a logical place, and that's why the Chachamim don't agree with it. But it's still, nonetheless, it leaves. So let's say that's true, but still, it raises this question about if we say safek nefashot lahakel, wouldn't that mean that even if there's a small chance of saving someone's life, that you would do it? Right? That seemed to be a working assumption we had. We also had it in the case that we now have touched on twice about if somebody is ill and we're consulting people, right? We're
Mm.
consulting experts. So there also, do I need a rove? Do I need a majority of people who agree that he needs to violate Shabbos or violate Yom Kippur or not? And we saw that it's not, even though generally, yeah, but it's not so simple. It's not always so clear that you would necessarily do something. And so now the Gemara Shmuel puts this as a straight mamar. In Pikuach Nefesh, we don't go after the majority. So Michael continue. Hey chidami. So now the Gemara itself is going to try to figure out what this means.
Hechidami, what's the case? If we say that there are 10 Jews and one non-Jew among them, uh, there is a majority of Jews in this case. Rather half and half. And when there's a suffix nefashot, we rule leniently.
Mhm.
Rather, there is 10 guys, 10 non-Jews, and one Jew.
Nine,
This
right?
also
Nine
no,
goys.
excuse me,
Nine.
nine guys and one Jew. But also, this is obvious that that there is kavuas. It's set. It's
You
set.
can leave it at that because
Okay.
we'll have to explain what that means.
And all that's set is like half on half.
Okay, so let's stop here. So let's stop here and go through what are these cases that the Gemara is referring to. So we say lo hachlu b'pikuach nefesh acharu. So hey, like you said, hey chidami. So what's the case? What case are we talking about where we would say that we don't go after the rov in pikuach nefesh? So it says, "I nema diikatisha Yisrael the goy echad beinayu." So if you say there are 9 Jews and there is one non-Jew among them, Ruba Yisrael dinu. So most of them are Jews. So before we go on, so what's the case and how is this related to? How would this be related to pikuach nefesh? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about 9 Jews and one non-Jew. Right. The Gemara here doesn't explain, but we are going to use Rashi instead of breaking our brains. We're going to use Rashi to see how Rashi explains this. So, Paul, you can read Inema.
הנה מתישה ישראל וחד נוחי, נפלה מפולת על אחד מהם, ואין ידוע עם ישראל אם נוחי הוא.
Okay, so explain.
Okay, he explains the נימה תישה ישראל וחד נוחי, the pasuk read, yes, and he says that if there was mapolת,
We'll say
avalanche.
an avalanche. Well, nagid.
An avalanche, yes. And but maybe it's an avalanche. And we know that there is a person being under the rubble, yes, but we don't know if he is Israel or if he is a God.
Okay. So that's the.
It stops here.
Yeah, no, it stops exactly. So it stops here. So
it doesn't. Okay.
Well, so here's the thing. So let's understand the case. And we understand the reason we're using this case, the reason Rashi understands this to be the case of Mapola, is because actually that's in our Mishnah, right? The
Yeah.
Mishnah talks about that. And we understand that Shmuel's statement, Lo hachu b'pikuach nefesh acharov, it's brought here in this context. And so now I want to understand how is it applicable to this case of Mapolet. So when we read the Mishnah, we weren't talking. We were talking about a single person, and the idea in the Mishnah, just to remind us. Let me see if I can just pull it up very quickly. Hold on. Yeah. Let me change the screen. And let me enlarge what you're seeing. Right, so this is the Mishnah, which technically in our sugya, we're in the middle of this Mishnah, right? Now we're getting up to this point. Right before this was about the remedies. And that's where we said, Kol safek nefashot dochen to Shabbat. So right after we said Kol Safek Nefashot Docheh Shabbat, Mishnah said Mishnah Falav Mapolet Safek Usham Safek Eino Sham Safek Chai Safek Meit Safek Nachri Safek Yisrael Metaklin Alav Agal. Right. So what's the implication? If you knew for certain that a Mapolet fell on a Nachri on Shabbos, you wouldn't be Mefakeh the Gal. Right? That's min hadin. I'm not saying this is halacha l'maaseh, but min hadin, you wouldn't necessarily dig out, you wouldn't violate Shabbos for a non-Jew. Certainly you wouldn't, certainly you would not violate Shabbos for an Oved Avodah Zarah. For someone who you knew to be an Oved Avodah Zarah, you certainly wouldn't violate Shabbos. Bizman Hazeh, we mentioned this, and we'll go into it much later. I don't want to get bogged down on this point. For the purposes of this discussion, we understand that Bizman Hazeh, for various reasons, we do save the life of a non-Jew. For various reasons, we save the life of a non-Jew. Meaning, we even violate Shabbos to save the life of a non-Jew. But here, for the purposes of our discussion, we have to understand that the Mishnah is saying that we do distinguish. We distinguish between the life of a Jew and the life of a non-Jew. So, if you saw somebody, let's say, go into an old building and then the building collapsed, and now you have all of these svekot, but nonetheless, you go and dig them out. You try to dig them out at least to the point where you can determine if they are alive or dead. So now, back to our Gemara. So now we're going to pose a slightly different question. What if there was a group of people, 9 of them were Jews, and we know this. We know that 9 of them are Jews and 1 of them is a non-Jew. And then a mapolet fell on one of them, and presumably the other ones scattered. We can't identify them. So now I don't know whether a Jew or a non-Jew is under this pile of rubble. So, lo hachu b'pikuach nefesh achar harov. So we say, so what's the case that we're talking about? In other words, where will the principle of rov be important? Where would it be applicable? So if you say that we're talking about an avalanche that fell on somebody who was one of a group of 10, where 9 of those 10 were Jews and 1 of them was a non-Jew, well, Ruba Yisrael Minhu, most of them are Jews. So what's the Gemara saying?
We don't have to. We would go ahead and clear the rubble. We would. It's not a. It is the rove.
They are the robes. So certainly, in other words, I don't need any special dispensation to tell me that I don't go after the robe, because here they are. The Jews are the robe. So of course I'm going to try to dig that person out. So palga, so like you said, half and half. Sfek nefashot lahakel. So what does that mean?
Then in the case of 50-50, it's a case of sefek nefashot. Then we rule in leniently, and we would go ahead and clear the rubble, try to save the person.
Okay, so what? Okay, so palga means half and half, meaning half what and half what?
Oh, half Jews and half non-Jews.
So let's say there were 10 people, and we knew that half of them were Jews and half of them were non-Jews, and then a mapolet fell on one of them. So also, safek nefashot lahakel. What is that? I'm sorry, you said something. So say it again.
So the idea of sefek nefashot because it's a safek nefashot, that we rule leniently, and we would then allow to clear the rubble because there's 50% chance that the person underneath is a Jew.
Right. So in other words, so what does safek nefashot lahakel mean, and why is it being invoked here?
Because it's no longer the rove. If it's 50-50, it's it's not the rove.
Okay, so this safek, this is what we call a safek shakul, right? In other words, it's a 50-50 chance. It's an evenly weighed out safek. There is no rove, right? There's 50% chance that the person under there is a Jew, and there's 50% chance that he's a non-Jew. So we already learned that safek nefashot lahakel. So in the case of a safek, even if it's a safek shakul, or I shouldn't say even, certainly in the case of when it's a safek shakul, I will be mekil, meaning I will violate Shabbos to try to determine if that person is alive and if I can still save them.
And
Okay.
in which case we don't need the teaching of Shmuel again.
And that exactly. So because he says you don't go after the rove. So here I know I don't go after the rove because first of all there is no rove, right? In the first case, there's a rove, but the rove is Israel. So of course I'm going to violate Shabbos. In the second case, there's no rove, but I already learned another klal that in the case of a safek, I'm going to be mekil. Ella, so Paul, do this next one. Ella deika tisha goyim v'Yisrael echad.
Okay. Ela deika tisha goyim v'Yisrael echad. Right. It says that if it's the other way around and there are 9 goyim and one Israel, well,
Then
what does
what?
it mean? Then there is no safek nefashot lahakel?
Well, so what are we trying
What
to
does it
determine
mean?
here? What's our basic question? What's the basic question the Gemara is trying to answer?
שהולכים אחר הרוב.
Right.
They try to explain what does it mean, the role.
Right. So we're trying to figure out a case where where Shmuel said lo hachu bepikuach nefesh achar harov. So I want to find a case where there isn't a rov, and nonetheless I'm going to violate Shabbos for pikuach nefesh. I want to demonstrate a case that's going to illustrate Shmuel's ma'amar. So Shmuel just said lo hachu bepikuach nefesh achar harov. So where is there a case where there's a rove that would tell me where the rove would indicate that I shouldn't violate Shabbos? So
and it is a situation of pikuach nefesh.
And it's right. In the case of pikuach nefesh, there was a rove that would argue against violating Shabbos. So, and Shmuel says, in such a case, we don't go after the rove. So, what's that case? What's the case where I have a rove that would argue against violating Shabbos? So, this is the right. So we had 3 cases. One is 9 Jews and 1 goy. So that's a rove that would argue in favor of violating Shabbos because most of them are Jews. I had the case of 50-50, half are Jews and half are not Jews. And so there isn't a rove that would tell me that I should violate Shabbos, but I already know that I'm going to violate Shabbos because it's a safek and safek nefashot lahakel. So then I finally come to the third case, the ika tisha goyim v'Yisrael echad. So what mamafien, right? What characterizes this case that's different than the other cases? In other words, why should
the
this
rov goyim are the rov.
the rover goyim, and therefore why? So the Rov are Goyim. So therefore, what would that indicate to me regarding Pilul Shabbat?
According to פיקוח נפש, לא הולכו לפיקוח נפש אחר הרוב. You have, again, to have to, because there is a Jew among them, and you are not sure. Never, you still have to dig him out.
Okay, so this would seem to be the case, or at least a case, that would illustrate Shmuel's klal. Right? So Shmuel's klal is lo halchu b'pikuach nefesh achar rov. So I'll say, what case could that be? That could be a case where there was a group of 10 people, 9 of them were goyim, 1 of them was a Jew. A mapolet fell on one of them, and I don't know which one, and I can't determine which one. The only way I could determine is to start to dig that person out. And so based on what Shmuel is saying,
you still
then,
have to
violate
Shabbos, to violate Shabbos, yes, and to dig him out.
Very good. Okay, so that would, so it feels like we have an answer to this question of Heichi Dami. Right? What's the case that Shmuel was talking about? But what does the Gemara say immediately after? So, Michael, ha nami pshita.
Nami Pashita. This also is obvious that it is kavua, that it is set, and anything that's set is like half on half.
Okay, so this needs explanation. The Gemara here is referring to a klal that, as I mentioned to Michael, it's used in a number of other places, and there's sugyot, which I was thinking I should prepare. Maybe we'll glance at them. Maybe we may have to take more time. But for the moment, let's just try to make a reading. As before I make a full reading here, let's think about what we know about the concept of rov. So we already know from other places in our learning that when there is a doubt about a collective, then the majority of the collective determines the identity of the collective, determines what the collective is. So let's take a couple of other examples that we're familiar with. So, for example, if you have a court case, right? So you know that in a halachic court, you always need an odd number of judges, right? The least is 3, and it goes up from there into different increments. But you always need an odd number because we know that when judges have a case before them, they may not all agree. And so when they don't agree, we're going to go after the rov, right? The rov is kovea. Similarly, if I have, if I have 3 pieces of meat, and I know that 2 of them are kosher and 1 of them is treif, but they get mixed up, and there's nothing that distinguishes them. The same cut of meat, but if 2 of them are kosher, now effectively I go after the rov and I'll say any one of them, in other words, all of them become kosher because of bitul. That's midioraita. That's the din dioraita. We don't hold midirabanan. You need a much bigger proportion that's kosher. But midioraita, chad betray batil. 1 in 2, 1 that's mixed with 2 is batel. Meaning it's void. Its identity has been voided. Right, and so this is the whole idea of, let's say, batel b'shishim, which we have with basar b'chalav, right? If you drop some milk into a tavshil of basar, so if there's more than 60 parts of the tafshil basar than the milk that dropped in. So the tafshil is still kosher. Midoraita, you just need 1 and 2, but midorabanan, we have all, depending on what the isurim involved are, we have different proportions that the Rabbanan instituted. But the point being that the rov is koveya. So I have this idea that the rov is koveya. The rov determines. And in the cases that I just brought you, it means the rov is what determines the identity of the whole. So if you have the Beit Din where 2 out of 3 argue to exonerate let's say they'd say they give an award to the plaintiff in a case. So that means the Beit Din gave the award. We don't say that 2 judges gave and 1 didn't give, because either you have to give it or you don't give it. Or it's either you find in favor of the plaintiff or you don't find in favor of the plaintiff. So in the case there, the rov is koveya. It means that the Beit Din as a whole now has given the award. In the case of the milk that falls into the fleshik stew, what I say is I don't say this is a fleshik stew that has some milk in it. I say it's a fleshik stew, right? In other words, if there's a rov that's fleshik, it means that the milk is batel, right? The milk, it's as if it's not there anymore as milk. It's now become, for halachic purposes, and it's assumed the identity of being fleshik. Okay. And now I'm talking about this rov here. So here I have a rov where 9 of the people are goyim, and 1 of them is a Jew. So based on the klalim that we just discussed, if that would be the case, I should say that the Jew lost his identity. But but what did Shmuel say? Lo hachu b'pikuach nefesh achar harov. I don't go after the rov if it's a case of pikuach nefesh. In other words, that Jew didn't lose his identity. He's still a Jew. So this is an exception to the case of rov. But the Gemara says, Hanami Pshita. That's still also obvious. Why? In other words, this particular case of 9 goyim and 1 Jew, and a mapolet falls on 1 of them. This is also an obvious case. In other words, what's obvious? It's what would be obvious about the case. I'm not gonna, that might be confusing. I'll just say it means that obviously I'm going to be mefakech et agav. Obviously, I'm going to dig out to find that person, but not because of Shmuel, but because this is a case of kavua. The whole kavua kemechza mechzadam. So what does that mean? And so now let's invoke another cloud that you're probably familiar with. That we're talking about rov. There's a cloud that says kol, right? The Gemara is going to mention in a moment. Kol de parish meruba parish. Anything that departs from or is separated from, it separates from the rov. So what does that mean? This is why I should have set this up beforehand. Paul, are you still with us? Maybe not. Okay. This is too bad because this is something that we need to pay attention to. 1 second. What I'm going to try to do, I'm going to try to explain this without bringing text. And next week, the Li Neder, I'll send in advance. We really need to take some time and look at some other sugyot. So we have other cases. So we have, this is another, we,
No. No.
hold on. Let's take a look for a second at something else. Um, there are two sugyot, one in Ubot and one in Sanhedrin, which I think we're going to take some time to try to understand them, even though this will feel like a digression. In a way, it's a digression, but it really is a very important. It's a very important issue. I'm going to show you this Breita. And this is in the middle of the sugya, so I'm going to have to go back and put it into context, but consider this right now to be an introduction. Good morning, Ketubah Daf Tedvav Amud Aleph. Hatanya Tesha Chanuyot. There are 9 stores. Kulan Mochot Besar Shchuta, V'chat Mocher Besar Nevela. Okay, so you have like a strip mall, and you have 9 butcher stores all in a row. I'm sorry, 10 butcher stores all in a row. 9 of them serve kosher meat, and one of them serves treif meat. V'lakach me'achat mehen, and you bought from one of them. Ve'eno yodea me'eze mehen lakach, but you don't know which one you bought from. Sveko asur. So you're masupak, right? You have a safek about whether the meat you bought is kosher or treif. In other words, you bought from a store, and just to give it a little bit of like a reasonable possibility. Now the next day, you have this piece of meat, but you don't know if you bought it to give to your dog and you bought it at the treif store, or you bought it for yourself and you bought from one of the kosher stores. So you might say 9 times out of 10, that's going to be kosher, right? Because there are 9 stores that are kosher, only one is treif. So you might think, well, I'll go after the rov. The rov would tell me that this meat is kosher, but actually sveko asur. The safek here is asur, and we have to consider it treif, even though there's a 9 in 10 chance, you would think, that the meat is kosher. So here it feels like we're not going after the rov, and we'll see why. This is the case of kavua. I'll explain kavua in a second as best I can. But then it says uvenimtza halecha harov. But if you found the meat, then you go after the rov. What does it mean if you found the meat? It means you're walking down the street in front of this, row of 10 stores, and you see a piece of meat on the street. So if you found the meat, then it's kosher. Then you go after the rov. So I've set up 2 distinct cases. One is a case where I bought meat from one of the stores, but I don't know which one. So in that case, if most of the meat, even if most of the stores sell kosher and one sells treif, the safek tells me that it's asur. Now that I don't know, it's asur. But if I found the meat outside of the stores, then I go after the rov. So this
What
second
is
case,
outside? What is outside?
outside of the stores. You found it on the street in front of the stores. In the first case, you actually went into one of the stores and you bought meat. But now when you're looking at the meat, maybe it's the next day, maybe it's later, maybe it's after now. Now you don't know. You're no longer certain if you bought from a kosher store or from a treif store. So in that case, your safek is asur. But if you didn't buy the meat, you just found it on the street near these stores, then you'll say, I go after the road. Chances are that it came from a kosher store. So the first case is the case that we call kavua, and kol kavua kemechtzal mechtzadami. In the case where it's kavua, in other words, where there was a time and a place. This is how I'm going to explain this best I can. This is the way I explain it. There was a time and a place where you knew what the reality was. That's kavua. So there was in the kviyut here is that these stores are fixed. They're in a fixed place. When you walk into one of the stores, if you walk into one of these stores, and let's say you didn't check before you walked in before to find out if it was kosher or not. Every store has to be seen as a store unto itself. In other words, it's not part of a rove now. It's just a store. And it could be kosher and it could be treif. So there, it's a safek shakul. But when you find meat on the street, the assumption is it came from one of these stores. Now there's a collective. So now there's a rove. And there I would say, I go after the rove. Hold the parish, meruba kaparish. Anything that has been separated from a group, we say that it was separated from the rove, right? Because the chances are that it came from the rove. But those chances don't apply when you were in a store and that store had one identity. It's just now you don't know what you're now misupak, whether it was kosher or treif. So that's kavua. Kol kavua kemechtzal mechtzadam. And benimtza, we go after the rove. So this is a short introduction to these concepts of kavua, kol kavua kemechtzal mechtzadami, and kol de parish meruba kaparish. So this take, at least for me, right? This is something that I have been thinking about for many years. There's a lot written about it. And I feel like what I explained to you now is, I hope, a reasonable and relatively easy to grasp understanding of these concepts. Today, what I want to do just to finish off, because we're going to be working on this for a while. So now let's just understand this in the context of our Gemara. So in our Gemara, we have Shmuel. Shmuel says, in Pikuach Nefesh, we don't go after the rove. So we want to know, when is that applicable? What is he talking about? So we want to say, it would be applicable in a case where there are 9 goyim, there's a group of 9 goyim and 1 Jew, and a mapolet falls on one of them. So, because what would I say? Now I'll say, even though the rove is goyim, and I shouldn't be b'chalel Shabbat for them, but since there's one Jew, the pikuach nefesh lo hachu achar, and I would be mefakech hagal, I would be b'chalel Shabbat. But the Gemara says, no, that's not a good case, because Hanami Pshita, obviously in that case of Tisha Goyim, the Yisrael Echad, I'm going to be Mechal Shabbos. Why? Because that's a case of Kavua. The whole Kavua Kemechzal Mechzadami. So now, how is it a case of Kavua? We'll talk about that. But just for the moment, before we get into the details, the Gemara says, this is not a case where the rove will apply, because it's a case of Kavua. In the case of Kavua, it's always a 50-50 chance. And I know from the previous example, Palgu Palga Safek Nefashot Lakel. Right? So it wouldn't matter how many Goyim, as long as there's even one, could be 1,000 Goyim and one Jew. Right? But if it's a case of Kavua, Kol Kavua Kamechzal Mechzadam. So it can't be that case where Shmuel's klal will apply. So Gemara says, lo tzricha. No, I still need that case, but I have to modify the case. The parush l'chatzer acheret. It would be a case where one of that group separated themselves and went to a different courtyard. Mahu detema. What would you think? Kol de parish, meruva parish. Then you would think, since that one person separated themselves from the group, now that other cloud called the parish meruba parish, that's what would apply. They're like lahavdil, they're like the piece of meat in front of the stores. They have separated themselves from the group. So now they're no longer part of the group. So since they're no longer part of the group, I'd say they must have broken off from the rove. And the rove are goyim. And then that would be a case where Shmuel's ma'amar would make sense, because he says, "B'pikuach nefesh lo hachuach." Right? So even though now the normal klal would be that since this person separated themselves, I don't go after the rove, and I will be mefakech et hagal. I'm sorry, he was parish from the rove, and I shouldn't be mefakech at the gal, but because I don't go after the rove, I will be mefakech at the gal. I will be b'chalal Shabbat. So kamash malan dalo b'pikuch nefesh achar rov. So this is kamash malan. What? Shmuel's statement that lo b'pikuch nefesh achar rov kamash malan, that in that case lo hachu b'pikuch nefesh achar harov. So this is also going to get challenged, and we need to understand this case a little more. I'm just going to read Rashi for the end, and we're going to go over this next time. And I want to spend next time, I'm going to prepare a little bit more to give a little bit more background on these concepts of Kavua and Kol de Parish, because in my mind, especially if this is the first time you're encountering them, they need a little time to sink in. So Rashi says, "Ela de'ikati shenachrim v'chad Yisrael." So this is the third case that we're bringing, and we're trying to say that this must be the case where Shmuel's statement that we don't go after the rove is going to be applicable. So when would it be applicable? When there's 9 non-Jews and 1 Jew, and then a mapolet falls on one of them, and I don't know which one. If I go after the rove, I wouldn't be Mechal Shabbos, because most of them are Goyim. But according to Shmuel, I should be Mefakech Hadaga. I should be Mechal Shabbos, because the Pikuach Nefesh lo hachu achara. When you're trying to save the life of a Jew, you don't use the klal of going after the majority. This is what Rashi says. Vashma'inen, this case is going to indicate to me, it's going to teach me the Afal Gav, the Reuben Nachrim, even though most of these people are non-Jews, Chayshinan, Shem Yisrael, who we're afraid that the one person that the Mapalit fell upon is a Jew, Umafakhlid. And so we're going to we're going to dig them out. But then the Gemara says, Hanami Pshita, that that's also obvious. Why? The Kaimalan, because we established as halacha kol kavua k'metadami. And how do I know that? Rashi refers to the sugya in Sanhedrin, the nafkalan b'Sanhedrin of the Ketuvot mi va'aravlo, right? From this pasuk of va'aravlo, v'chiya ish sonel re'ehu, right? A person hates his neighbor. V'arav lo v'kamala, right? So he's like, what's the word? He like set up a trap, or he's I don't know how to translate that, but meaning V'arav lo v'kamala v'ikal nefesh, right? So he was like lying in wait for him and to attack him, and then he attacks him, and then he dies. So the V'aravlo indicates he had specific intent for that one person. He was Aravlo. It wasn't just that he happened to kill somebody. It was Aravlo, like he was setting out to kill him. So what do I learn from that? I'm going to overly simplify here this Gemara and Sanhedrin. The Aravlo prat l'zorek even lago. So that excludes the case of somebody literally who throws a stone in the midst of. In other words, there's a crowd of people. Some guy takes a big stone and he just throws it and it kills somebody. But that's not va'aravlo, because he didn't intend to kill that particular person. And so this is the basis. This is the, I should say, this is the scriptural makor, right? The scriptural basis for this cloud, kol kavua kabechtel mechzadami. And we'll see a little bit better how that works next week. So then the Gemara says, no, I need the case of 9 goyim and 1 Jew for the case of when one of them separated from the crowd. And he went to a different courtyard. And the mapolet fell when he had already removed himself from that group. The bechol duchta amrina, because in every place, meaning in every other place, I say, kol the parish meruba parish b'midei denaidi. I say that everything that has separated from a group, it's separated from the majority regarding things that move. But I don't say it here, even though this was a person who did move. So I'm saying kol the parish meruba parish doesn't apply here. The afal gav the beprishatan kulhu naidi. And even though when when they separated, actually all of them were moved. All of them were mobile. And so the klal of kol deruba, kol de parish meruba parish should apply, but because it's a matter of pikuach nefesh, Shmuel says it doesn't apply. Okay, that's our initial reading. And like I say, I'll send you sheets, and I'm going to also try to work up some other sheets because I think it's important. To me, this is always been a very important cloud, and and I think it's also fascinating. I think it's very, it indicates to me, right, a very sharp understanding of how one might look at things. So I've never, except for whatever I learned in high school about probability and statistics, I'm really not an expert on this. But I think you can see the difference between these cases. of kavua, like at least on some basic level. There's a difference between kavua and kol de parish. So I want to examine that further next week, and I'll be happy to get more input from both of you and your own experience or both understanding, both the Gemara and from your respective professions to whatever it might be helpful, and we'll get more insight into this.
I already made this remark that I don't understand if you have a pikuar nefesh.
Yeah.
Why do this analysis? You have to be very quick. You have to do something to. Why do you start to count and to think? Is he a Jew? Is he a goy? Is it 50-50? Is it like this way or the other way?
Mm-hmm.
You have to take care of the person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think
don't.
no. So first of all, I think you make a very good point. The quick answer is this is exactly what Shmuel is saying.
Yes,
Shmuel is saying what you're saying.
He's right. He's right.
Okay. But the point is that this seems to be what Shmuel is saying, that in other halachic contexts, then this concept of rov and what's rov and what is batel legabe harov and so forth, that's all relevant there. But when it comes to saving somebody's life, that's not relevant. You just have to act. What we're doing in the Gemara is we're trying to understand, that's the point. We're trying to understand Shmuel, trying to understand when his klal is applicable.
Yeah, I
But
understand. It's bediavad. It's when we are sitting on our chairs and we have a lot of time and we were not hungry and it's not too hot and now we can think about this. By the way, you have there is, I don't know if it's similar, but it reminds me. But I think I already talked about it, about in ethics, not Jewish ethics, but general ethics. You have this trolley problem.
yes, of course.
Of this
We have
car
it in,
which comes down here, and also you go according to the law. You should save as many people as possible. That's the general idea.
yeah, but in halacha we don't
And you
necessarily say that.
don't ask
We
is he a Jew? Was he not a Jew? Is he a black person
no,
or a
but
white
there by
person or
the
something like this?
but
He's a human being.
you know that the Mishnah and the Gemara deal with this question in different circumstances. There's a Mishnah in Trumot that says you have a group of women and a band of thugs comes and they say, give us one of you to rape, or we'll rape all of you. So you might say, based on your
Yes.
right, your ethical, based on you saying like it's general ethics, so you should give up one. But we don't do that because we ein mosri nefesh achat Yisrael. You never give it up. But and then there also there are cases there that's in Trumot. There's Yerushalmi there in Trumot that talks about if you give up one person to save a whole city. And there also it depends. It actually depends on the person. Depends on the person. Depends on why are they demanding that particular person? Maybe he deserves to be punished. So these are all very difficult questions. They're all and you don't. But it's interesting that you bring it up in this context because there in the Mishnah, it's not talking about the rov. It does. In other words, the rov is not a consideration. The rov is the fact that you'll save more women by giving up one is not a consideration. There you don't go after the rov because you have an isur of being moser nefesh. Here, and there's going to be a difference also ethically, right, between actively giving someone over to be killed or punished or raped, as opposed to the case that we're talking about in the Gemara here, something happened to somebody. And now, how do we act in the wake of that? anyway, so you bring up very good and relevant points. I hope to go into them a little bit more next week. I'm going to try to prepare a little bit more about this Kabua and Kol de Parish. Like I say, these kalim appear in other contexts. There's a sugya that talks about in context of Tuma and Tahara, and we have this case of Tesha Chanuyot. The Gemara in Ketubot is also talking about um, case of a woman who may or may not have had relations that would be posel her to a Kohen. There are all kinds of cases. And also just to throw in some other variables to think about. The way the Gemara that we looked at briefly in Ketubot, the Brighty looked at briefly in Ketubot, it says Tesha Chanuyot. So we say, so in our mind, what did I say? There's like a strip mall. I just said, like, think of this as like 10 stores in a row. But what if it's not 10 stores in a row? What if it's 10 stores in a city? In other words, at what point do I consider something to be a group? How do I define the group to begin with? What makes something a group and what makes something that's poresh to be poresh from the group? See, in the case that the Gemara that we're talking about, it seems to be very clear cut. You have 10 people, you see 10 people, and you happen to know that 9 of them are the 9 of them are goyim and 1 of them is a Jew. You happen to know that, and then they disperse. So now they're no longer a group. So is it relevant that they were together and now they're not a group anymore? What's the relevance of the fact that they had been grouped together? How do you define the boundaries of what makes something a group for the purposes of Rove? Anyway, all interesting questions, but and I'll just end off by saying that right now we're dealing in what it seemed like very theoretical cases, and they are. But these are the cases that serve as the basis for dealing in the real world, because there are real world consequences to these concepts, like, as Paul is indicating. All right. Anyway, just
Yeah,
one bit
I'm
of
thinking about also on other circumstances, but okay.
yeah. So I hope that next week come and
next week we will be in the Tiyul. I will not be here.
That's too bad. That's too bad.
Is the tune too bad?
Well, no, because here you brought up all these good points, and I want you to participate. So hopefully, we'll. But don't worry, we're going to still be talking about this in 2 and 3 weeks. So just a couple of other things I should mention, not having to do with the topic, but so one of them is I just wanted to express my personal joy because I did finally write the last column of this Sefer Torah that I've been
Mazel
working
tov.
on for the past.
What do you say? Mazal tov? I don't know. What's the...
You can say Mazal tov. There's still work to be done, and it's not, I think I explained, this is not really going to all be done till next year, but writing the last column is really like the end of an era. And I have to go back and
But
do
you will invite people to write the last words. I think so, no?
In this case, there are going to be thousands of people who were going to be involved. I don't know.
That sounds like a mess.
You will have to be present there for all those people? It's going to take you a lifetime.
Well, no. It's not going to be all at once. It's going to be over probably several weeks or months. And it's going to be in different locations. And until we do the very last words, I don't know, that'll be sometime next year. And so that's, but nonetheless, it's a real milestone that I was able to finish. So I wanted to share my good news.
Who is going to sewing together all those
I will sew them.
You do this yourself?
Yeah, I usually do. Sometimes I subcontract that, but I probably end up I will probably end up doing this myself. But again, not for a while, because I'm not going to sew it together until we filled in all of the other places that need to be filled in. So
And
that's
it
one
seems
thing.
somebody already working on them.
On what?
It seems.
The seam. We're not even up to that yet, but that I have a place that'll do that for me in Israel. I have a couple of places that I go to. The other thing,
not in. You should do it all in the States. No, that was the condition. No?
well, what the condition was that I have to write every letter.
You have to write every letter, but it seems
Right.
you can bring them from
Yeah, look, we
Israel.
also the cloth was made in Israel. Like it's
The cloth comes from Israel.
cloth
Okay.
comes from Israel. The gidin come from Israel. The deal comes from Israel. Everything else comes. It's just that he wanted every letter to be written here for whatever reason. The other thing is, and I'll remind you, I redid my ticket. I was going to end up coming back on the morning of Erev Rosh Hashanah. It was a
You come back
mistake
for the Chagim. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll come back, and actually, I'll be coming back. And there's not from here on in, I will finally be back to living in Israel and just visiting the States. But I changed it to leave on the 17th, which is a Wednesday.
Wednesday.
It's going to be a Wednesday. I'm going to be leaving
when
on
is
the
Rosh Hashanah? On which?
Rosh Hashanah on the Tarikh Loazi. It's on the night of the 22nd of September.
So it's a week before.
Right, because I was supposed to come back in the morning of the 22nd. When I made that ticket, I wasn't looking at the calendar carefully. I thought it was the day before Erev Rosh Hashanah, but I was wrong. And I have to stay here until the 16th because I'm going to be filling in letters at an event on the 16th, but I'm leaving the next morning on the 17th. So that will be a Wednesday, which means we're not going to learn that week, and also the next week is going to be Rosh Hashanah. So
Rosh
we'll end
Hashanah is on Wednesday.
On Wednesday, the second day of Rosh Hashanah.
The second day of Rosh Hashanah.
The second day is Rosh Hashanah. So I may try to see if we can make alternate dates so that we don't lose too many weeks. But as we come closer, I'll figure that out and see what everybody's up to. Okay, so anyway, enjoy your tiyul, both of you. Michael's already on tiyul.
I'm on a tiyul now. We'll be back.
Okay. Have a good week. Have a good Shabbat.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Toda
Thank you.
rabba.
Good night.
Bye bye.